Well, good morning if you are in San Francisco, California. Good afternoon if you're in Port Jervis, New York. Good evening if you are in Stockholm, Sweden, or Accra, Ghana. Or good overnight if you're in Melbourne, Australia, or Hanoi, Vietnam. People who listen to Fred Plotkin on Fridays all over the world on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is a fellow that I've known and occasionally worked with. I'm guessing 40 years. That is a good round figure.
That's about
Many
right.
people know who he is and they know his name, but we're going to find out a little more about his background and what he does beyond being Brian Zeger, who I'm going to start by calling you a musician, Brian. And then we're going to get into all the different aspects of what it means to be a musician, because you're diverse in your exploits, in your work. You are a performing artist. You are an academic. You are a writer, a scholar, a broadcaster, and probably a good cook. Are you a good cook?
Um, Coming to be, COVID was a great cooking instructor for me because I had to become at least a capable cook whose food I
Yeah,
wanted to eat. So yes, that was
very good.
uh, well,
So I'm going to start. I mentioned Port Jervis, New York. You're from there. Where is Port Jervis, New York?
Port Jervis is at the intersection of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the tri-state
Uh-huh.
area. And I grew up there until I was in 11th grade. I went off to boarding school.
And what's Port Jervis like? I've never been.
Well, I was born there in 1957, so I was really there through the 60s into the 70s. It was a very, I would say, small town conservative atmosphere. We were a Jewish family, which was a little bit of atypical in Port Jervis, I would say. And it was for me a place, there were of course some wonderful people there, um, wonderful family friends. I grew up with a sister and brother there as well. But for me, in terms of my cultural interests, intellectual interests, certainly musical ones, it was a bit of a desert. But I was extremely lucky, Fred. My parents were very kind and certainly supported my interest in music. So I started piano lessons a little bit before I turned 5 years old. But when I was getting to be about 7 years old, they found a very gifted piano teacher for me in the next town over, which is Middletown, New York, slightly larger town of maybe 20,000 or something. I don't know. A very gifted man called Morris Bornstein, who became kind of my musical father. And having all these years at Juilliard and my whole time in music, meeting so many musicians, they all had some kind of early musical parent, whether it was their biological parent or someone from the community that found them, an early teacher or conductor or person in their public school. For me, it was Mr. Bornstein. And it turned out that his youngest child had just kind of left for boarding school himself, actually. So he was kind of an empty nester. So he adopted me as a kind of musical protege, much more than just a piano student. So that's what made life in Port Jervis kind of interesting for me and still a place of growth. And then because of changes in my family, I went off to boarding school and left Port Jervis and honestly have scarcely been back since 1972.
So here's a question I've only asked one other person in regards to his upbringing. If you were very into music and playing the piano, did you play sports and were your hands worried about?
Well,
No.
I didn't play sports because I had no interest in it and I was terrible at it. I mean, the
Hmm.
little bits that you had to do in public school were torture for me. That was just not my. Wasn't about protecting my hands. All I wanted to do was listen to music, play the piano, and read books. That was my entire childhood. If I could have designed my own, that was all I would have done. And I got
The
pretty
reason I
close.
asked is that the other
Yeah.
person with whom I discussed this, I knew personally, was a boyhood friend of mine. He was older, was the pianist Andre Watts.
Oh well.
And he and his mother were family friends of ours. And I grew up in Manhattan, very close to where you are at the Juilliard School, about a block away. And Andre wanted nothing more than to play baseball with me. and his mother was horrified at the prospect
Yeah,
of him hurting his hands.
yeah.
And one day we went to Central Park. We got two baseball mitts, and we just played catch, throwing the ball back and forth. And he was so happy, and he
Yeah.
didn't break his hands. But when his mother heard that, she threw a fit and said, "You can't see Fred again." So we would see each other like on the side to play a
That's a
little
great story.
catch.
I was not tempted to such pursuits, Fred. So my hands were perfectly safe. Let's put it that
Very
way.
good.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that moving forward a bit, I know you went to Harvard and you majored in English literature. What was your subject and what was your thesis if you did a specialty?
I wrote well, I was a non-honors major, which was pretty rare because I was pretty busy playing the piano in those days too. And for me, the Harvard English degree was fascinating. I loved every class I took, but I knew I wasn't going to become an English academic, so I had no academic ambitions to go beyond undergrad school in terms of English studies. But I wrote a long paper on Henry James' The Ambassadors, which is a novel I still love. And yeah, that was my Harvard career. But I was very busy playing. I always knew I would become a pianist. And I loved
Hmm.
the quote I read, which I may be misquoting now, but I read somewhere that Charles Rosen said that you get to be a pianist by refusing to become anything else, or some version of that was pretty much true for me. I mean, I had a lot of intellectual interests. I mean, I suppose I could have gone to law school or done all the different things people do that are very productive in the world, but I just knew I would be a pianist.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what kind or how to do it at all. I had no sense of how you earned a dollar doing that, but I just knew I would do that. And I would say that that realization hit me probably when I was 10 years old.
Hmm.
I was in Juilliard pre-college by age of 12, thanks to Mr. Bornstein, who actually sent me there, much against my will. I would have much have been I was very happy, studying with him, but I needed a broader musical environment, which the Juilliard pre-college certainly afforded me, and he was right about that. Um, but I know my undergraduate degree was just an incredibly pleasurable uh, playground for reading and talking to really smart people, learning as much from my fellow students as I did in classes for sure, because it was extremely bright, open-minded group of folks, and who are still among my best friends,
Yeah.
50 years later.
And did you, while at Harvard and you were reading and studying, I imagine, history and other topics as well,
Yeah.
begin to explore the places and the figures of music? Let's talk
Oh
about
yeah.
Liszt or the important pianist Chopin.
Oh yeah. All of that. Well, I took some music classes at Harvard too. Not all that many, but I mean, just getting to know these cultural centers to be thinking about, Paris throughout the 19th century or turn of the century Vienna or the issues around the French Revolution and what that meant for Beethoven and et cetera. Yeah, that all started, those pieces started to come into focus. But what's interesting, I think, for somebody who I read English and American literature primarily in those choral classes. So, if you're looking at Hemingway or George Eliot or Jane Austen, you're not necessarily tacking those into the sort of German tradition. You're not thinking, oh, she was the same time as Schubert, or he was, it took quite a couple more decades for me to sort of put those pictures together, that the cultural knowledge I'd begun to amass in this very magpie kind of way, a little bit of string, a little bit of straw. Um, did start to form a larger picture for me, and looking at historical films as part of that. I mean all of it, reading history, as you say. It's all part of the same fabric, but it took me a long time to get the sort of bird's eye view that would allow me to see it that way.
I must say that when I was our age in college and was reading Hemingway, Hemingway to me was an opening to Europe because the very
That's
first
because
book
of the
I
Paris
read
stuff.
was The Movable Feast, which was one
Yeah,
of his last books, um, about his life in Paris and
yeah,
eating pigeons and hanging out with Gertrude Stein, and how
yeah,
Gertrude Stein, he wrote, looked like a Friulian woman. And I didn't know what a Friulian woman was, and I
uh,
discovered it's the region of northeastern Italy that's Friuli, Venezia,
yeah,
Giulia, that I later wrote a whole book about, in part
yeah.
because Hemingway pointed me that way, but also because A Farewell to Arms was set in Friuli in the Veneto.
Oh
And
yeah,
so Hemingway brought me to Spain. He brought me to lots of places
yeah. It's
as a
wonderful.
vivid writer rather than say, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote about America. It was
Yeah.
more Hemingway who made me interested in European culture, and with that, the opera world and the music world and so on. We were talking about having musical parents. My father was a musician, so I
Uh,
grew up with it right in the home. And
yeah.
my
I was not that lucky, Fred. That just was not my fate. My parents were didn't know much about classical music at all. Honestly,
yeah,
no one in my family. I can't trace any other musical talent or really particularly musical interest throughout my whole larger family, among, aunts and uncles and grandparents. But again, over all these years, being at Juilliard and watching young people come up, I, I've come to think that either it's truly dynastic, where practically everyone in the family is like the Bach family is, oh, I had an uncle who was a violist in the Berlin Philharmonic and another grandfather was a publisher, or that kind of thing. It's either dynastic or it's absolutely, completely singular. And I think the singular ones are not that surprising. And it's interesting. I meet young people from China or Russia or Africa, and I'll say, how did you get interested in classical music? And say, I don't know. I just always, from the first piece I heard, I got it. I think people are wired to perceive it and wired to take it in, which I know I was even well before I was 5 because I requested piano lessons. So it meant something to me. And there are other perfectly intelligent, cultured people in the world for whom that language of music just doesn't resonate with them, and that's fine.
I have a friend who lives in Stockholm, who I mentioned Stockholm before, who is a wonderful guy. He's intelligent and cultured and open to things. But he has said to me numerous times, I don't have the Mozart gene.
Uh-huh.
And by that, he
Interesting way
means
to put it.
it doesn't work for
Yeah,
him. Not
yeah.
music, just Mozart.
Oh,
It
okay.
it leaves him cold. I tried to take him. I was in Stockholm to Don Giovanni. I had tickets. He really protested. He came, but he was unhappy. He visited here in New York, and I took him to La Notte di Figaro at the Met. Very unhappy. He was saying, "Don't they have Fidelio or Nabucco or something else? They only
Uh,
have Mozart right now." And so, do you
it's
feel that?
wild, but
Yeah,
but people
I was gonna,
change. And I remember as a let's say in early teen years, I mean, I already really loved so many composers and really actually had a lot of musical exposure, but Wagner seemed absolutely nonsensical to me. I would listen to, 10 minutes of Tristan or 10 minutes of The Ring and think, what is this? There's just nothing there. And boy, I could not have been more wrong. And I had a real conversion experience with Wagner much later. I would say probably when I was in my early 20s. And then I became absolutely converted. And I couldn't then reconstruct how much I had missed in it. And, but it comes to you when
did
it
it
comes.
happen with a particular work of Wagner?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, it was a strange moment to catch the bug because it was the Zuckerberg film of Parsifal. I was
Mm.
taken by some friends who thought it was an amazing film, and they were Wagnerians already. They weren't actually musicians, but they loved it. And it was down at Film Forum, or one of those terrific revival houses that are so sparse now. But I remember recognizing right away that this was a really serious artistic venture as a film, because as long as that piece is, you might think they would roll credits during the Vorspiel. No, the Vorspiel went in sepulchral silence, and then then the Vorspiel started. I thought, oh, we're really in for it now. But I I I was I entered into that through the Vorspiel. You have to go through you can't do it another way. I have a story about that too. It was funny to me. But I entered and I never came out. It was a true conversion experience for me. And it's funny because all the music I loved going back to Bach, I would say, and loving counterpoint and loving hearing chromatic harmony and rich textures. I just thought, what was I missing? This is just the summa of all that. And I still feel that way.
Do you have, I won't call them blind spots, but are there composers who just don't do it for you? And I mean, of the greats, the
Yeah,
famous ones.
yeah. They're composers, but usually I sort of get them. I get what's great about them. And well, Tchaikovsky, I have to say, there are a
Ah,
handful of pieces I absolutely love. Really, Onegin, Rococo variations. I can certainly stretches of the symphonies, and but even with the pieces I don't love and get annoyed by and get bored by, I do get why other people like them. I mean, he's an incredibly effective composer. I think he's a very, very fine composer, but I just don't need to keep hearing it. I feel like I people probably will throw tomatoes at their laptops when I say this because I know people who love
And
Tchaikovsky.
that's, true confession time. That's how I feel about Brahms.
Oh no.
Exactly as you described it. They're beautiful passages. I love the Alto Rhapsody. Adore the Brahms German Requiem. I think it's a magnificent piece. There are other pieces of him I like very much. I like very much.
Wow, and he's way up in my pantheon. That's
I
interesting.
know. And years ago, I was talking to James Levine about this, and he asked me which composer has grown most in my estimation and value. And I said, Schubert. He said, absolutely. He said, it's not easy, but once you get Schubert, you're in for a treat. And he said, which one has not quite grown yet? And I said, Brahms. He said, not good.
I'll tell you, I'm also fascinated by watching how certain composers or even styles kind of their stock falls, rises and falls. I remember when I was a student pianist in my teens and 20s, I would say of the often played European composers, Prokofiev was really up there. I mean, everybody played Prokofiev sonatas. Certainly the third concerto was an absolute cornerstone. Lots of Prokofiev his symphonies were very important, and I still admire that music. I think he's a fine composer. But for instance, compared to Bartok, let's say, I mean, I just feel like one has risen. Bartok is maybe even in my top 5 now. And Prokofiev is nowhere. He's a footnote for me. As fine as it is, and as craftsmanlike as he is, certainly very virtuoso. But and if you'd asked me that at 18, I probably would have put it the other way around.
You are, and I should say that I meant to tell our listeners today is August 1st of 2025, so it's midsummer in New York. You are what is described as nowadays a collaborative pianist.
That's what they call it.
Yep. The term of the past of the Gerald Moore days was accompanist.
Yes.
Sort of the servile person behind Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau or Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, who was there in service to the singer. Now it's a very different phenomenon. Talk about, and I think it's great, talk about the evolution of the collaborative pianist from the servile accompanist.
Well, I'm happy we're talking about this. It's interesting. Graham Johnson, who's a very great pianist and scholar and writer and recording artist, he doesn't mind the word accompanist. I don't either. I mean, it just never felt servile to me. But I will say that, I mean, we could talk forever about all the indignities they're visiting upon pianists going on the road with singers. That's just our lives. And it's petty to talk about it, really. But I would say collaborative pianist does encompass much more because, I mean, wouldn't you say that Menachem Pressler, a very great pianist, played for decades with the Beaux-Arts Trio with incredible success and every kind of chamber music, but also there was solo music in his career. He played concerti. I don't know if he played for singers, but I would say collaborative pianist is just a much broader umbrella, Fred, and encompasses also pianists who play in orchestras as orchestral pianists, people who work behind the scenes in opera houses and are not seen on the stage so much, but are absolutely vital to the opera ecosystem. Collaborative pianist, I am proud of that label because I think it suggests versatility, depth of musicianship, an openness to collaboration, to partnership, to musical partnership, which just feels like more than the pianist walking out in tails behind Madame X and to play that recital and who can't sort of do anything else. The reality is, I look around at my kind of peer group of pianists, people like Warren Jones or Martin Katz. We can name all kinds of names. Graham Johnson, Malcolm Martineau. They're much more rounded musicians than the term just accompanist would suggest.
If I'm correct, and I could be wrong, very late in his career, Menachem Pressler played with Danielle Denise, the
Oh,
soprano.
I didn't really. Wow.
I'm pretty
I didn't know
sure
that.
about that.
That's
I
fascinating.
can check it, but I'm pretty sure on that one.
Mm. Uh,
Um, which is an interesting a nice combination. Um, you have worked with, and drop a bunch of names, Marilyn Horn, who is a mutual friend of both of ours, Deborah Voigt, Anna Netrebko, Susan Graham, who was my guest on my 5th anniversary show here, Renee Papa, Kiri Tikhanova, Frederica von Stade, the only guest to appear twice on this program, Piotr Bachava, Bryn Tervel, Joyce Donato, Denise Graves, Adrian Pachonka. So each one of these artists, wonderful, all of them are, but each one is very different in terms of what they perform, in terms of their vocal personality, in terms of how they relate on the stage to the audience, perhaps, and you don't have to name names, but how they develop a program with you, the collaborative pianist, and what the give and take is. You can name people if you want, or you don't have to, but it's really, I'm interested in the process.
it's all very different, Fred, because I encountered a lot of these different artists at all different moments in their career. By the time I met Marilyn Horn, she was a world famous artist for decades already. And she essentially presented me with programs we would play. I had the pleasure of working with her for about 10 years, so we went through quite a lot of repertoire. And she was an extreme, even in those later years of her career, very, very disciplined about learning music thoroughly and really, really knowing it well and working it in, but not only sticking with the same program. She remained adventurous, but she had such a long career. It started so early for her, and of course those great early years of studying with Lotte Lehmann meant that she had this very, very broad foundation in lieder and in recital music in general. So she could just plumb her own archives and keep coming up with new programs of recycling music she'd known from decades before. But she also was open to new ideas. So that was an extreme pleasure for me, and I was very impressed with how diligent and how adventurous and hardworking she was, when she was certainly a great, great star who could have done one recital for the next 10 years. People would have been happy to hear it over and over again. She was really disciplined about that. And
she sang for Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Wow.
Did you know that?
No.
When she was 5 years old, he came to Pennsylvania where
Amazing.
she was living.
Pennsylvania.
And her father worked for the Democratic Party, where most of the people around there were Republicans. So Roosevelt came to meet the Democratic Party leader, and little Jackie Horn was brought up to sing for FDR.
Amazing.
So that's how far back it goes.
Well, it makes me think a little bit. One terrific singer I played for many years and still a very dear friend, Robert White, the tenor. It was an Irish tenor. He was a marvelous recitalist. I had the incredible pleasure of playing at the Clinton White House for him for a St. Patrick's Day party, which was a great honor, of course, to be at the White House and play for Clinton. And Seamus Heaney was also on the stage, etc. But Bobby White happened to drop the little factoid that the first time he had played at the White House was for Truman. So, talk about a long span of and anyway, so all these artists. To go back to your really interesting question, the one important patch of work in my life I'm really proud of was the collaboration with Deborah Voigt over the years, because when she and I first started doing recitals together, her opera career was thundering along. It was in the first, I would say, 10 years of her big opera career, all the Verdi and Wagner and Strauss that audiences love her for. But she had not really ever been a recitalist, and her college career got cut quite short because she went very early to the Adler program at the San Francisco Opera. So she, dove into opera in her early 20s, which meant she didn't have a lot of background in recital music. So I had the incredible privilege and fun of trying to think of great pieces that would really thrill audiences, but that really suited that kind of big, dramatic soprano voice, which is not what people necessarily associate with recitals. But I was very proud of what we came up with together. We went through a lot of repertoire to find programs that worked, and that was I felt not only super proud of what she did and what we did together, but also I felt that audiences that loved song got to hear a tranche of great music that, was not for Ellie Ameling, was not for Arlene Auger, was not even for Schwarzkopf. It was really for the woman who sings Isolde, the woman who sings the Kaiserin, etc. So I was very proud of that.
So I'm going to make a brief Marilyn Horne statement, then I have a Deborah Voigt question.
Okay.
One time Marilyn called me up and she said, I know we're supposed to have lunch tomorrow, but I can't. I'm going to Wyoming. And I said, why are you going to Wyoming? She said, I've sung in 49 of the 50 states, and I wanted a gig in Wyoming so I could say that I've sung in all 50.
I
So
love that.
she was that much of a completist that she really toured America and the world, but America. And she kept track of such things that
Yes.
she would remember that Wyoming had not yet been visited for a recital.
Impressive. And she never stinted on efforts. I mean, she was just, as I say, an incredibly disciplined, focused artist. And particularly in my years with her, in a time where she could have been resting on her laurels, honestly. She didn't. She didn't.
Now, Deborah Voigt, one of the best performances I've ever heard, I loved her in a lot of things, but was with the New York Philharmonic, I believe Kurt Masur conducting, of Strauss's Four Last Songs.
Yeah, I was there.
And
Yeah.
I remember talking to her at the time and to other people and hearing that basically Richard Strauss's conception of the soprano who would sing that music was more the Deborah Voigt type and less in the Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, Renee Fleming, Kiri Takanawa type.
Yeah. Well,
And so when I heard it with that sound, let's say Eileen Farrell type voice and presentation, do you have a feeling about how those songs are maybe number one Strauss intended, but number two, how they work best?
Well, I'm so happy to talk to you about this, Fred. You have such a deep love and understanding of all this. I think they work both ways. I think from what I'm not a scholar. I didn't come prepared to talk about what was really in Strauss's mind. I don't know if he had a specific singer that late in his career, perhaps not. But and Lisa Della Casa, if you talk about really quite a light voice.
It was I'm suddenly forgetting her name, the great Norwegian dramatic soprano, the predecessor of Birgit Nilsson.
Before Nilsson.
Kirsten Flagstad.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
They were written for her? Wow. Gee, I don't think of that voice in it either. But, I think they work both ways. I would say the lyric voices who sing it bring out a kind of freshness and a kind of pinpoint accuracy in the intonation. And they can do a lot. I think I knew Kiri's interpretation quite well. I also watched Kiri teach that piece a lot. But then you get, Jesse Norman, Deborah Voigt, these big voices sing it. It's a masterpiece that I think can encompass that whole range. I wouldn't want to choose. I'm thrilled not to choose, frankly. I think that's.
But I remember Masur saying that he felt that Deborah Voigt was the singer at the time who most closely represented what he felt Strauss wanted.
That's great. Well, she's a fantastic Strauss singer, and in so many areas of her voice. I mean, we always had Strauss on our recitals. I think all the way through, we never did any with it that missed Strauss. And I would say our kind of signature piece that we both loved was Frühlingsfeier, that big barn burner, which is so difficult for voice, so difficult for piano. That was the piece we were very proud to present. And that is not for the faint-hearted. I don't want to hear Ellie Ameling trying that. As great artist as she is, but it's true.
I don't think everyone knows. Please say who Ellie Ameling is, because
that great
she influenced my music appreciation, but she's not someone that people in the opera world know.
They're missing something, and she's very, very thoroughly recorded. So just go seek her out. Ellie Ameling is a great Dutch soprano, still very much living, very much teaching. And I was at one of her last recitals, certainly in Tully, when she was probably reaching 70 or even maybe a little bit past 70. She had a long, decades-long career and was very, very widely recorded going through the whole Lieder repertoire multiple times in some cases. Also very beautiful in French repertoire. I think she's undervalued in that. But for me, it was a pinpoint voice with extreme subtlety, wonderful kind of Innigkeit, innerness. Really a great artist.
And wonderful in English language popular song.
Yes, she recorded a whole thing of Cole Porter and Gershwin.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. A great stylist, wonderful with pianists. She recorded with a number of pianists. I think Rudolf Janssen great Danish pianist,
Mhm.
probably is the one I know the most recordings with, but she recorded with a number of people. And just the way she listened, a close colleague of mine once pointed out that with some of these artists that we so value in the recital repertoire, I'd say certainly Fischer Dieskau, certainly Janet Baker. When you listen to them, you understand this complicity with the piano it was much more than just being with the pianist or the pianist being with the singer. It was being inside that piano sound. And that
Mhm.
kind of immersion in the larger ensemble is something we try to really instill in our students at Juilliard for sure. It's a very important part of my teaching. But I think great musicians like Ellie, Ameling, Fischer Dieskau, these folks, they come with those extra antennae, those extra large ears that can hear in that way. Jan de Gaetani is another person I would say had that
John
kind
de
of
Gaetani,
ability
absolutely.
to listen on a very deep level.
In other words, listener, there are these singers out in the world who are primarily recitalists and song singers
Yeah,
rather than opera singers, but whose vocal capacity and temperament and everything is as great as our beloved opera singers.
true. And then you also have to think of those truly crossover artists like a great recitals like Hermann Prey, who's also a
Yeah.
fantastic opera singer. Uh, Listen, I think Fischer Dieskau in his way was also a great opera singer, just on his terms. I think he approached those roles in a very idiosyncratic, highly intelligent kind of analytic way, which really worked. Janet Baker, we could go on. There are many examples of
Herman
it.
Fry gave me my first voice lesson when I was 13
Wow, how did that come about for?
because he was a friend of the family and the work that was done in the family. And I was a good cook even as a kid. And a lot of these people, like Andre Watson, his mother, Marta Argerich, Herman Pride, the people we knew, Axel Schutz, the
Oh,
wonderful
wow, yes, of
Danish
course.
singer. Axel Schutz was a very close friend of our family. Um, they would come over and I would cook. We had a piano. We had one of these New York apartments. It's down the street from you on 66th Street,
Uh-huh.
where on one side of the wall would be the stove and the kitchen. The other side was the upright piano.
Okay.
And while I'd be cooking, someone would go to sit, Martha Argerich at the piano, and play. Andre Watts, Nelson Frere was another one who came by a
Oh,
lot. And I would cook, and Herman Price heard me singing along, and he said, "Have you ever had a singing lesson?" I said, "No." He said, "You want to be a singer?" And I said, "Yeah," but I didn't think I had it. And so he taught me Papageno's Act One aria.
Wonderful. What a great memory. Yeah.
And I auditioned and got into what was then called the High School of Music and Art, singing Ein Vogelfänger bin ich ja, taught to me by Herman Prey. So,
That's wonderful. So
um,
I knew Mr. Pry quite late in his career. Actually, it's when he was in New York singing Beckmesser and had some recitals coming. I wasn't scheduled to play those recitals, but I prepared them with him. And then later we were supposed to do some recital work and we did the rehearsals. I had the great honor of going through these songs with him, but just for various health reasons, we never made it to the stage
yeah.
together. But what a great artist. I mean, I just had real
I
reverence
want to
for.
ask you about another artist. You may not have worked with her. I never did until I met her in England. Um, there was a period about 10, 12 years ago when I taught for several years at Oxford. And they had the Oxford Literary Festival. And one year, my collaborator, as she said, my conspirator was Jesse Norman. Another year, my collaborator was Dame Felicity Lott.
Oh,
And we
wonderful.
would
Yeah.
do presentations together. I sort of grew up listening to Kiri Takano, and they were sort of the two dames of that time and place who did the same repertory. And Felicity Lott said to me, "Well, you do know that I'm a very fine singer in the French." And you were talking about Ellie Ameling. And
She
I
was.
did not, frankly, I didn't know that. I knew her for the Strauss and the Mozart and the roles that Curie did. But she really was. And I suppose, we think of certain, I'll say Susan Graham. I think of as a magnificent singer of French repertoire and has real
Absolutely.
affinity and feeling for it. But I discovered in that period at Oxford that so too did Felicity Lott.
Certainly did.
When you meet a singer, let's say a famous singer for now, not the young artist that we'll talk about in a moment, how do you, if you're working on collaborating on a recital, feel out what she or he may have that they may not have revealed? or have a strong feeling for? And how do you get that onto a concert program?
Well, it depends on how they reach you, Fred. I mean, sometimes you get a contact really honestly from a manager saying, "Are you free on this date? Here's the date, here's the program, here's the fee, and are you on?" And so you take what's received. But I would take it's such an interesting question. Then, of course, you meet them for the first time at the piano. You have X number of hours to put this together, sometimes quite a short number. And that's when it gets really interesting because you have to immediately begin to pick up where they're coming from musically. You know, how cooked in is the program? Do they want to just sort of do it the way they've always done it? And you're basically kind of performing a kind of tape recorder function for them, or do they want to really put something together that's new? I have to say, I'm pleased to say, very many of the artists I played with, and again, some of whom I came to late in their careers with after they had decades of time on the stage, they were pretty open to just being musically in the moment. It's not as if you stop and say, "Wait a minute, I think the breath should be here, not there." Of course not. They're not students. It's never that moment. But you just play for real. In fact, I remember one of the very first exchanges of words I had with Marilyn Horne. She asked me to do some performing with her, and I remember we sat down for the first piece, whatever that was, I won't recall. And I said, "Well, what's your tempo for this?" And she said, "Honey, you start. What's your tempo?" You start. So that was typical of her modesty, really, and her openness. It was such a wonderful. What you start? What's your tempo? Like I don't play this part. You play it the way you want. But that all said is a little bit idealistic. There also are moments when you get called in to do something and you've got very little time or practically no time to rehearse, and there you're very grateful for a YouTube. If you can hear how they've done it before, at least you get a ballpark, because you can't start coming from a totally different direction. All those collaborations are different, Fred. You have to feel out how open people are to adapting to new ideas.
I could ask a question two ways. Either what is the first recital you heard, or what is the first recital you heard that moved you?
I can tell you if I had better internet research skills, I could probably find the date. But I was at boarding school, so it was I would say somewhere in the 73, 74 performing year. I graduated in spring of 74. It was at Symphony Hall, Boston. It was Fischer Dieskau and Jörg Demus doing the Schöne Magdalena cycle of Brahms, which is very seldom performed, honestly. It's certainly seldom performed complete. It's a full evening cycle. I didn't know it very well. I loved Brahms. I knew Brahms as a composer. I knew who Fischer Dieskau was, but I never heard him live. And it's a really daunting evening. It's a full 90 minutes of German lieder. And you're reading along in your programs. And it was interesting because I got a solo ticket there. I was a poor little 16-year-old. I probably scraped together money. I don't know how I did it. And I know I happened to sit down next to a woman who had stumbled in there for no good reason. She was not even a classical music lover, etc. And I thought, wow. And we were chatting a little bit before the lights went down. And I thought, gee, for this woman, this is going to be a daunting, dry, difficult 90 minutes. And she was absolutely bathed in tears. The communication that he brought on from the stage. And it's interesting because people often speak about him as a kind of a cerebral singer or quite analytic, maybe not as emotionally connected as some others. Whatever that was that night between Brahms and Jürgen Demus and him and us, everyone got it. It was absolutely like the most extraordinary silence in Symphony Hall, which is, seats not much less than Carnegie, a big old wonderful auditorium. And I was converted from that moment. I understood what lieder was live. I'd heard it a lot and I'd heard some so-so recitals before that, but that occasion, and it was so touching to me that I was sitting next to a concert goer who had absolutely no background, didn't know a word of German. She wasn't even actually following along the translation. I happened to notice that people were reading it, but she wasn't, and she was as moved as I was.
It happened that my first recital that I attended was also the first one that moved me. We were talking about collaborative pianists. The pianist that night was named Alicia de la Rocha,
Wow.
and the singer was Victoria de los Angeles.
Uh-huh.
and it was New York about 1965, 66. And this tiny little woman whose fingers barely touched the
Yeah,
piano and whose
yeah,
feet barely hit the pedals
yeah.
was playing magnificently. And I was not a pianist, but I knew that this was really special. My dad said, "You're not going to hear accompanist," as he used the word then, like this. And his favorite soprano was Victoria de Los Angeles. His favorite mezzo was Marilyn Horne. So I was raised on de Los Angeles and Horne.
Yeah.
And when de Los Angeles at a certain point came out and took out a guitar and played by herself and sang, that had me. That was it.
Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story about that. She's not in my bio, but she should be really, because the person who truly got me into playing for singers was Eleanor Stever. When I turned up at Juilliard in September of 1978, I needed to make a living. I needed money to pay rent, and there were only two names on the Juilliard teaching roster that I knew. One was Dorothy DeLay, the famous star-making great violin teacher. Just knew her name. And of that whole list of teachers at Juilliard, the only name I knew was Eleanor Stever, because she was in fact, well, Rose Bampton was still teaching them, but I didn't know her name. But Stever was famous to me. So I knocked on her door, absolutely blind, and said, "Do you need a studio accompanist?" And she tried me out, and we hit it off right away. But I'm circling back to Victoria, because Stever was very unbuttoned. She would talk about anything. She was absolutely unfiltered by this time.
Yes.
This is long after her main performing career. And she was just talking about other famous singers of her time, and she would say, and that Victoria, she walks out with this guitar, and we can all just forget about it. Everyone loves her. She was so jealous of that charm. I mean, Miss Stever had so many other fantastic qualities, but she comes out with that guitar, forget about it. It was so touching to hear you tell
As
that.
it happened, Stever was the first opera I attended. Stever was the star with Wozzeck.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And
She was an extraordinary. Boy, do I wish I could have had a tape recorder on her, or somehow had some science fiction ability to go back and listen to her coach those pieces, because I heard her coach. I mean, they did reach into me at some point, even though I was so inexperienced. But she taught Knoxville to everyone. She taught Vanessa to everyone.
They would Knoxville and Vanessa are, because you and I know, but we're speaking in short.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. Thanks for the prompt. Samuel Barber's Knoxville was written for her. It's a marvelous piece for soprano and orchestra, also sometimes done with soprano and piano. But a piece she was very close to, because it's about a Southern childhood. And of course, she was from Wheeling, West Virginia, so she knew the world that James Agee, the text writer, wrote of. And also Barber's Vanessa, of course, was also written for her. It was a piece she was very, very close to. But so much repertoire. I mean, I remember when she would work on Rosencavalier Trio with young students, taking them through it. She would always tell the story of her home. Her weekend home was in Port Jefferson, Long Island, and she would take the ferry over to Connecticut to coach it with Fritz Reiner that summer that she was first learning it. And I thought, oh, that's the way singers learn their music. They take a ferry, and she said everybody thought I was crazy on the ferry, because I'd come back from Maestro Reiner and I'd be writing in my score and kind of singing the pitches and digesting what he'd told me. And I thought, wow, is that how singers learn their music? Not so much after that.
That's pretty wonderful.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is wonderful. I want to ask you about one singer who I like very much. I've never met her, although I got to sit in on rehearsals when she did Rosencavalier in Los Angeles. Maximilian Schell was directing, because I knew him a bit, and I was invited to, and I was working at LA Opera at the time. I was invited to be around the production. Adrian Pichonka.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful
I know
artist.
you worked with her. I think she's terrific, and I've never met her or conversed with her. But you worked with her.
We did a lot together. We did a Strauss CD together for Delos Records. And quite a few recitals, I would say, over maybe stretching over 10 years. I mean, her career was majority opera still at that time. Very intelligent artist. I would say very self-critical in a very healthy way. She really thought very hard about what she did, and did her work with tremendous integrity and tremendous love.
And she's Canadian, and if I'm correct too, she and fellow Canadian Gerald Finley have the distinction of being two opera singers who appeared on Canadian postage stamps in their lifetimes.
I didn't
because
know.
in
I didn't know that about
America,
Ireland. Thanks.
oh yeah,
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that. Yeah.
because in America you have to be dead to be on a postage
Yeah.
stamp. But in Canada, they're a little more enlightened. They honor their Canadians while they're still
Well,
around. And
they
they had
both
a
certainly
series that
deserve it.
included John Vickers and Teresa Stratas and Gerald Finley and Adrian Pachonka were the
Yeah.
four.
And knowing you, Fred, you probably have the postage stamps, or do you not?
No, I don't have those. I wish I did. Had I
Okay.
known, I would have grabbed them.
Well,
But
listen,
um,
it's interesting that you bring up Jerry Finley. I mean, he gave us some classes at Juilliard when he was just recently here for Antony and Cleopatra and John Adams, and they're marvelous classes. But I was not prepared to go into that opera house and hear such extraordinary singing, top to bottom. I mean, that role is so punishing. Many, many top Gs that most baritones would stretch for, and
yep,
that entire range. I think Jerry Finley is still completely at the top of his game, and
absolutely.
not new to the game. Let's put it that way.
And he was on this program about a year ago, and people can go to YouTube or Adagio and enter Fred Plotkin, Gerald Finley, and it was one of my best conversations. This leads me
Fantastic
very
artist.
elegantly into what I was going to ask you next. Um, I have been attending performances, master classes, and so on at Juilliard, occasionally teaching for many, many, many years. And I keep hearing new singers come out, and I set my eye on them, and I think this one or that one, I really have to follow most of them. But there was a young woman a number of years ago um, who, and I'm suddenly blocking her name because it's hot summer, who just sang Cleopatra with Gerald Finley.
Oh, Julia Bullock. Yeah,
Julia Bullock, thank you, of
yeah.
course. So Julia Bullock is a much younger artist than Gerald Finley and completely held the stage with him and in John Adams' difficult music and all the acting and the big production. And when I created Fred Plotkin on Fridays in April of 2020, my first guest was Thomas Hampson, my second, Christine Gerke, my third, Ben Hepner, my fourth was Julia Bullock.
Really?
Because I
Wow.
wanted very early on when she was, now she's a big star, but even then she was just sort of at the very beginnings and it was
Yes,
the
very much so.
pandemic. And she was fascinating then. My fifth was Ferruccio Furlanetto. So those were my
Yeah.
first five. And that's a long time ago now. It's 5 years that I've been doing
She was
this.
just out of school, Fred. I mean, maybe
Yeah, she was
a year
just
or
out
two
of
out of
school, but
school.
I remember thinking she was living in Germany, and I remember thinking I saw her, I heard her at Juilliard. She was really outstanding.
Yeah.
Let me see what she's doing, and nobody was singing because it was April of 2020. And she sort of said, "Me? You want me?" And I said, "Yes, I've heard you at Juilliard." And so Juilliard is one of the great training grounds in the world for the next generation of opera singers. Not just Juilliard, but I'm naming Juilliard right now because that's where you work. You are artistic director. I'm going to try to say the full name of the James and Ellen Marcus Vocal Arts Department of the Juilliard School. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Is it Ellen and James or James and Ellen?
I think it's Ellen and James.
Okay. So
Yeah, I haven't looked
let's
at it in a while.
start because I think this is important. Let's
James and
talk
Ellen.
about Ellen and James Marcus.
Sure. With pleasure. Well, I got to know Jim Marcus a little bit early on just through social circles and because he was so much around opera, such a profound lover of opera and opera singers, and also extremely knowledgeable about what he was hearing. So I had known Jim a little bit. And then when I stepped up to this job in the early 2000s, Jim had already been a board member of Juilliard for quite a few years. So I naturally had a lunch with him. I can't even remember if he requested that or I did, but it was a pleasure to talk to a board member who was so enlightened, and he'd had
Yep.
all the decades of opera going under his belt, and also a long time as the board chairman of the Metropolitan Opera. So he
Yes.
knew, the Tibaldis and Leontine Prices and Birgit Nielsen's and Joan Sutherland's as social friends, as the board chairman. So it was an honor to serve under his leadership on the board. But I was very proud as we got to know one another to welcome Jim into the classroom, into the coaching studio, because of course he'd been to all these great performances and he'd watched young people grow up. He was aware of the singers that come through the Lindemann program, but he had never seen, for instance, a young singer get their first Italian coaching. or get their first introduction to Schubert's song. That whole very early part of the educational pipeline. Well, who sees that? I mean, not people like Jim Marcus, who were, a great businessman from Goldman Sachs. Anyway, it was my privilege to bring him into that room. And in fact, one of the very first things I asked him was for a modest amount of money for 1 year to bring Renata Scotto to teach for a week or two, maybe 10 to 20 hours of teaching, some total like that. And he had never seen Madame Scotto teach. He knew her well, and he knew her as a singer. But to see her in that room, taking a phrase apart, going syllable by syllable, talking about vibrato, talking about intonation, talking about vowel quality, I mean, all those tiny, tiny little details. He came out of that week of coachings with his mind absolutely. He said, I had no idea how hard this was. Now I understand why it takes so long. And he later became very, very generous to our program and gave the big gift for which we named the program. And that really all came from my understanding that this very brilliant man was just missing one piece of the puzzle, which was that early piece, which is hidden for a reason. Most people should not be watching a 19-year-old be taught their first Italian aria. It's very painstaking. I suppose it's like watching a painter learn to mix paints. It's not the part it's not the glamour part yet. But he was so brilliant and he was so truly interested that after that he came to understand why it's so expensive to train a singer well, because all of those foundational building blocks of vocal technique, of language, acting, interpretation, musicianship, those all have to be laid in there, and it's a painstaking process and an expensive process.
He was chairman of the board when I was performance manager at the Met.
Oh, wow.
And he alone, of all the sort of big types there, took a great interest, not just in me, but in anyone he felt had promise or talent or needed cultivation. And he was very much a mentor to me.
That's
and
great.
Followed my progress and would call up occasionally and ask about what I'm thinking about, what I'm reading, what I'm writing about. He befriended my mother and used to call her up and say, how are you and what's Fred up to and how can I help? Not financially, although that would have been accepted, but that was not the point. But how can I open a door for Fred?
That's just great.
And
a true
occasionally, I would be out and about in Brooklyn or in Queens going to hear a young singer at a college or at a little startup opera company. And there would Jim be in a very uncomfortable seat, sometimes with his wife, Ellen, and making notes and then going up. I'm thinking of a particular company in Brooklyn. And he went up after to the woman and the man who founded the company. He said, listen, I'm willing to give you $5,000 to help you get your company going, but I expect accountability. And I want to hear from you in a week, in a month, in 3 months about what you're doing, how you're using this money, and what you're learning about how to manage your money to make your opera company work. And they were dazzled because they didn't ask him for money. He voluntarily got on the subway, perhaps took a car, and went to this far-flung place in Brooklyn, in the Gowanus Canal, and sat there on an uncomfortable seat and decided just to help them with his money.
A wonderful story.
Yeah.
Well, that rhymes with my experience with him, Fred, because in fact, when he similar parallel story to yours, he volunteered to give us a large chunk of money for this naming opportunity. But we spent about 6 months working with him on how the money would be spent. He both as a philanthropist and also he was the head of the board of Lenox Hill Hospital. I mean, he knew everything about financing and about budgets and all of that. And we worked very, very carefully to make sure that the money was going in a way that he really believed in and not being siphoned off for other purposes. It was very, very it was, I'd say, focused with great discipline on the part of the school. And I'm proud that our students draw on that every day. And now Ellen is quite ill and doesn't come to school anymore. But even after Jim's death, she came quite often, and I was so pleased to be able to acknowledge her and their incredible generosity to us. It has made all the difference. And I can tell you, on any day in Juilliard, what are the activities that are being supported through their monies, and that legacy goes on, and it will go on long past my time here. So I'm so proud of
That's a
that legacy.
distinguishing thing among many about Ellen Marcus, who's lovely and invited me to speak at the Cosmopolitan Club and other things, was that she said one time, I'd like you to come meet my cousin Paul and his wife Joanne.
Yeah.
We're having a few people over to their house on Park Avenue, and I went over. Paul Newman was her first cousin, and Joanne.
I knew that. Yeah. I never met him through Ellen, but I knew they were. Yeah.
And Joanne Woodward was a big lover of opera. Paul Newman, not so much, but he would come along, and he was always very friendly. And he too would make these sort of private donations when he saw that help was needed, but would do it anonymously.
Look, as both as an artist and also as an educator, my gratitude toward these extraordinarily generous people in the world, and some of whom have been in my life, and some of whom their names are just on the sides of buildings. But however that philanthropy flowed, we can only be so grateful for it.
So their name, James and Ellen Marcus, Vocal Arts Department of the Juilliard School. You are the artistic director. That's a big job. I've never asked this of someone in your position before, but when you have auditions to admit students to the program, what do you look for? Do you look for someone who's polished or someone who needs the polish, and you guys will do the polishing?
It depends on which program they're applying for, Fred. We start with a bachelor's program where they're coming straight out of high school. So they're 17 or 18 years old, and they can't be polished yet. That's just, they can't be. So that answers your question there. I would say that's in a way the most difficult admissions puzzle, because you're listening for vocal potential down the road, but it may be a ways down the road. So it's a bit of a crystal ball situation. I'm certainly listening for musicianship, because that certainly has showed up by then. By the time they're 17 or 18, either they're really musical, know how to listen, show a love of music. You're also looking for their qualities as a performer. You want to make sure that this is someone who can hold the stage, who likes being on stage, who feels they belong there. You can tell that even at that age. But then as the programs progress, then beyond bachelor's, we have a master's program, then an artist diploma program. Of course, you expect higher and higher, qualities of achievement in their own artistry. But, one thing I look at when we hear students from all over the world, but, if they've come from a good school so I'm aware that they've gotten good coaching, and they've gotten the correct information, and their performance is still full of holes and full of details that have been ignored or learned incorrectly, etc. That's a real black mark for me. That means they just have not been paying attention. Because on the other hand, you sometimes come across a young person from what would seem like kind of nowhere. I don't mean to sound snobbish, but a part of the world you just realize that there just aren't even conservatories there, but who will come maybe with a couple of mistakes in their music making. They might say a French vowel wrong, but they have really been paying attention. And that they may have gone to the school of YouTube in many cases, but they have been paying attention and listening with a kind of desire for refinement and desire for real artistic investment that can show up at age 18, it can show up at age 30, but when you see it.
I always find it interesting when I go to Juilliard and read the biographies of the singers I'm hearing, and they're from very far-flung places. For now, I'm just speaking of the United States, but the whole world, of course. Little towns in Massachusetts or Nebraska or Idaho, and where you would not, like Port Jervis, New York, but many times more, where you would not expect them to have any resources to discover this music and become good at it.
It's
and yet
extraordinary. Well, I'll tell you, Fred, we have our current freshman class, they'll be sophomores next year at Juilliard, of singers. We have 11 enrolled students. 3 of them are from Lagos, Nigeria.
Really?
3 out of 11. Yes. So what's going on and they didn't come together. There was not one teacher they all came from. Isn't that extraordinary,
So I'm going to bring something up. You and I are both Caucasian, obviously, but it's a topic that I try to delicately raise, but it's something I do to some degree believe in, and I try to explore this. I did it a few years ago in conversation with the tenor Lawrence Brownlee, who's of African descent. So many Americans of African descent, Black people, have rather glorious voices, and whether they're singers or not, and most of the slave trade, which is what it unfortunately was, that brought people from Africa to the Americas came from Ghana, Togo, Nigeria, that part of West Africa. I had the wonderful Nigerian British author Ben Okri, who
Oh,
is
really? Yeah.
an award-winning writer. He's a friend of mine. He's not a singer, but he has the most gorgeous speaking voice. And
Yeah.
I asked him about it too, and he was very diplomatic because he said, there are 200 million Nigerians, and he's right, or whatever there are. But
Yeah.
I've always wondered whether, to some degree, it's either the languages that they spoke in that part of Africa, whether it was the way sound production happened, whether it's just a genetic thing. But it's extraordinary how many wonderful voices, not singing, but voices I've heard from Ghana. My pharmacist is from Ghana. He has a gorgeous voice. Or Nigeria. There was a wonderful singer I worked with about 15 years ago, a soprano who now lives in Paris, whose name was Omo Bello. And
Oh
Omo,
yes, I
you
brought her in to
know her?
sing for the I brought her in to do an audition for Lindemann when I was in charge there, and I liked her a lot. She was not right for the program at that time, and I think we all understood that, and she just was going a different direction. But she no, I remember almost it was a very distinctively beautiful timbre. It
Beautiful
reminded
voice.
made me think a little bit of Golda Schultz actually in timbre.
Yes, like Golden Schultz. I
Yeah.
worked with her in 2012 in Verbier, where she played the Countess in Le Nozze di Figaro
You're
and
speaking of Omo now or Golda, excuse me.
Omo Bello.
Oh, Omo was the Countess. Okay. Because Golda does it
And
too.
so we had Thomas Allen, Ilyana Kotrubash, and Fred Plotkin working on this production, and
Okay.
three very, very different people working with these young artists. But everyone just sort of was floored by the gorgeousness of Omo Bello's singing.
Yeah, no, I
She's
remember her.
gorgeous. And yes,
Uh,
many, of course, from South Africa. Kamal Khan has developed a lot of singers there,
he did,
but
yeah.
but also West Africa, because the Americans of African descent are mostly from West Africa, not
Uh,
South Africa.
uh Well, I have to say I've never traveled to that part of the world, so I've not experienced anything culturally, myself. But the Nigerian students, when I have conversations with them about it, they've been singing all their lives. They sing a lot in their churches. And I have visited South Africa, and I met with the head of University of Cape Town vocal program there, who's actually the successor to Kamal, an Englishman who's teaching there now, and also the heads of Cape Town Opera. And they all spoke about the ubiquity of choral singing, of kind of community singing. And, I think if everybody sings some and they sing with this kind of comfort in singing, which I also associate with the Welsh. You think about
Yes,
how many wonderful Welsh singers there are. And if you ask Bryn Terfel about that, he'll just say, everyone sings in Wales. I mean, we're just comfortable doing that. He's quite unfussy about it. It's just part of how we communicate. And I guess if you have, however, again, hundreds of millions of people in Nigeria and everyone singing some, the good ones will rise to the top and find that kind of
there's a
recognition.
little difference, and maybe you'll agree, and maybe I think you can speak more to this than I can. Um, in West Africa, Nigeria, and so on, English is often the first language or the first common language. Whereas in South Africa, English maybe, but they're also the South African languages
Of course.
and Afrikaans. And
Yes.
Afrikaans, the placement of speech in South Africa is more forward in the mouth than
Uh-huh.
it is in Nigeria. And therefore,
True.
down to me of South African singers, Golda Schultz, Pretty Yende, all of the wonderful
Uh-huh.
black and white, Johan Botha, Dion van der Walt,
Yeah.
all of them, the placement of the speech and the singing, correct me if you think I'm wrong, is more forward than it's
That's
than
very. I'll have to think about that. That's a very interesting perception. Let me compute that. I mean,
because also wonderful
yeah,
thing in South Africa, the choral singing is just second to none.
yeah, for sure.
The harmonies and the way they listen to one another and sing and respond, it's thrilling. I've not been to South Africa, but I really want to go because just the sound of that singing to me is just so inspiring.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
One of the best productions of the Magic Flute I ever saw, the Zauberflöte, was done by a South African company on West 42nd Street. I don't know if you
Really?
saw it.
No.
And sort of set in a township,
Okay.
but done with South African musical instruments.
Yeah.
It was an amazing performance because the choral aspects, the singers' solos were great, but the choral aspects so got Mozart, but with a slightly different flavor,
Good flavor.
as
Yeah.
Owens would say, a different sauce, um, that it was thrilling. Brings up Eric Owens, wonderful bass baritone from Philadelphia. One of the great thrills I always have at Juilliard is going to master classes there. And I remember years ago that Eric Owens taught a master class in which Julia Bullock was one of
That's
the
right.
singers.
I remember.
And he basically said to her about whatever she sang very beautifully, it needs more sauce.
Uh,
And I remember thinking, okay, I know music, but I don't know what he means. And I couldn't ask at the time, but
yeah.
she completely got it and
Uh,
responded musically to what he was after. What's the language of master classes? You lead them all the time. How do you get through to a person with a concept that may be abstract, that may be emotional, may be very real to the person making the comment, but not the person receiving the comment?
well, and you've got two in a public masterclass. You've got two big hurdles to which are different than a private lesson. You've got a whole audience there listening. So the singer, the young singer in the master classes has that dual um pull on their concentration between performing and learning, which are contradictory impulses. And then the other thing is they're generally absolutely strangers to the master teacher. They haven't met them to that moment they walk on stage. Although I have to say, at most of our Juilliard ones that I host and organize, we try to do some private work with the teacher ahead of time. So that often that stranger thing is a little bit mitigated that way. But I think the most effective master teachers I've seen, and I would include Renee Fleming in that, Joyce DiDonato, Susan Graham, Malcolm Martineau, wonderful
Mm-hmm.
as a pianist teacher, and I could go on, but they know how to pick their battles, Fred. They know how to find a way in, often to a small detail, but which can open up a whole new way to sing or a new way to think about what they're singing. But you've got to find a very smart, strategic way in that is not threatening. You can't take a person with a much smaller voice and say, it should be 10 times larger. You're not singing it. That's just silly. In fact, I've seen that. I've seen that happen in classes. Why aren't you singing fully? Well, that is their full voice. They're 19 years old. You just haven't heard a 19-year-old in a long time, and you're not going to change that in 5 minutes. That's silly. But you can find, a word or a vowel color or a musical detail that can get them to listen in a different way, also get them to forget about the audience for a moment and find a kind of creative musical opening. I've seen that happen with a lot of those folks. But it's a special skill, and I have to say it's not necessarily one-to-one with the person who would be great in a private room with them. For instance, Renata Scotto was incredible in a private room because she would go down, she would spend 20 minutes on one note if she needed to. But if you were smart, you were learning everything you needed to know about singing from that one note because she could really show you that. But in front of an audience, she put on a different kind of performance. I mean, she was such a born, seasoned performer. She wouldn't go to that level of detail, which is where she was truly, truly effective. So,
Now, occasionally, and maybe more than occasionally, you're mentioning Renee Fleming, Susan Graham, Joyce DiDonato. These are big beloved stars in addition to great artists. And the biggest, most beloved star of our era, perhaps, was Leontine Price.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but certainly one of them, Birgit Nielsen, Joan Sutherland, Luciano. But she was a category of one. And I remember that she did a master class at Juilliard that I attended, sat with Jim Marcus, and what the audience really wanted, because her public appearances were rare, they wanted her to sing.
Yes.
And I felt so badly for all the students trying to sing for Leontine Price, who was, for the most part, she said, "This is not about me, where we want to hear these children." And she sort of turned her body away from the audience and listened to the singers, and she gave
Yeah.
comments. But then occasionally she would let out three notes, and the audience
Yeah.
would cheer.
Yeah.
And she,
Yeah.
"Quiet, children, it's not about me. Now be quiet." And at the very end, after the class, she said, "All right, this is how I might have done it." She sang half an aria just a cappella. But it must be hard. Joan Sutherland was very serious in her teaching
Yes.
and very blunt. And, I remember hearing her once say, "I don't know, my dear. I don't think it's the best approach." And then she would explain what a better approach is. But she was teaching. But
Yeah.
aura, the thrill, let's not pretend, of Leontine Price, as wonderful as Sutherland was, and I loved her, but there was just something very particular about Leontine Price for Americans that she couldn't, I wouldn't say she couldn't properly teach, but the obstacles were so high because
She
we
was
were
so,
in the
yeah.
presence of Leontine Price.
Well, it's so interesting we're speaking about her now, Fred, because we have a little summer program going for prospective high school students that come from all over the world. These are 15 and 16-year-olds. And last night we had a class from Susanna Phillips teaching these very young people, and she sang in Leontine's class. I think she sang Dove Sono.
Yes, you're right.
I don't swear to that piece. Of course, it's a piece that Susanna sang a lot, but I do remember Miss Price taking her hand and kind of singing it with her and kind of swinging her hand just to try to get her to loosen up. But it's interesting because I haven't talked about that with Susanna in a long time. But I think what a young artist can get, even if there's not an analytic point that the master teacher makes, or an insight that they can then take back to the practice room, I do think that with someone with the incredible charisma of Leontine Price and that love of singing and that incredible openness that she could create with the audience, I think you can catch that just by being near it. And I know that from, for instance, young artists who do comprimario roles, who sing, Clotilde or Anina, but they're in the presence of these great seasoned artists. Just to be on stage with them. I remember when Michelle Bradley sang Clotilde to
Sandra
Radvanovsky's Norma.
Yeah.
She said just to watch Sandra work through the whole rehearsal process and then through the whole run elevated her artistry. I can believe that. And it's interesting.
Marilyn about the opera Norma,
yeah.
And Joan Sutherland once said to me, "Well, my first role was Clotilde to Maria Callas."
There you go. And I remember Marilyn Horne quoting Carol Vaness when she was an Adler Fellow, saying, I can't say what, what's Inez is the comprimario in Trovatore, right? I think it was that with Price singing, and as a young person to watch Price go through Trovatore, that's it's something you catch, So that's a valuable experience in itself.
Awesome, but also Price, maybe Pavarotti too, but Price, the joy of singing, so palpable.
Yes,
and I knew her. I got to work with her a lot, especially late in her career. And she said, "Well, it's an honor to be able to sing this beautiful music by Maestro Verdi and Maestro Puccini and Maestro Mozart," because very late in her career, after she retired from opera singer, she started taking on music like Elettra, Elettra, in Mozart's Idomeneo. Just for the heck of singing. She said, "I never had a chance." And it's an honor to be able to sing. And I remember going to Newark, New Jersey to hear her sing that.
Wow. I wish you brought me along, Fred. I would have been up, Fred.
Yeah. Just because Leontine Price was singing a Mozart role that she would never touch and no one offered it to her.
Yeah. And speaking of the honor of singing, after the period during the public eye. When I was the studio accompanist for Eleanor Stieber, she would sometimes just go through songs with me just for the pleasure of singing them. She loved Hugo Wolf, and we would go through some Hugo Wolf songs, which she had been taught by Metropolis. Metropolis often played piano for her. And, Stieber's ear was so refined, so sophisticated. She'd been steeped in these decades of Strauss and all the great composers. And I remember playing Auch kleine Dinge of the first of the Italienisches Liederbuch with Stieber, late after a teaching day. Let's just get some music and play together. And the honor of that for me, and just to watch this, veteran artist, long past her vocal prime at that point, just enjoying being inside that music. It's such a great gift. We musicians are incredibly lucky.
So it leads to two questions for me. The first one is, when I go to performances at Juilliard and see the operas you do, Così fan tutte, Dialogues of the Carmelites, all these wonderful things I've seen, sometimes a singer will jump out at me, and others, I'll name one, Samantha Hankey, who was very impressive to me, and she was on my show a few months ago. I just thought she was very solid and would have a good career in front of her. Sometimes there are singers at Juilliard, but it could be anywhere, who show a lot of promise, but then I won't say their careers peter out, but they don't quite meet the expectation that we may have had for them. How does a career trajectory after school, in this case Juilliard, happen or not happen? And does it relate to a voice category? Does a tenor stand a better chance in the front?
I think it's often just those doors that open at certain moments for certain people, Fred. Some of that's really good fortune or bad fortune. I think with the ones that show a lot of promise but don't stick it out for the long run, or don't get those opportunities to move to a high echelon of performance, it's usually life stuff that happens, either the marriages they make, their involvements with their families, health issues, of course, for them or the people close to them, which happen in every life. Or the other thing I noticed that happens, and it makes me sad in a way, but it's just a part of the development of life, that, by the time they reach 30 or 35, something of the fire that they had to grow in this career starts to diminish. And they often find out that crazy life of an opera singer is not really what they want. They don't have that same hunger for it. All the successful singers we've been talking about for this whole conversation had a tremendous appetite for the work, a tremendous appetite for travel, for all the personal sacrifices, which you know as well as I do, are enormous sacrifices for them and the people around them, because it's such a consuming career. And I think by the time they get into their early middle career, let's say something like that, the torso of their career, sometimes they find out that they're good at it, they can do it, they could make a living at it, but they don't have that drive to continue to develop. That can be, and you can't know that when they're 21. They can't know that themselves because they don't know what the life is like.
The second question is, I knew Dr. Joseph Polisi very well, who was president of the school for many, many years. We would sit down and have talks about opera, about baseball. And he was a believer in the artist as citizen and taught citizenship as well. How does that come up, and is that explored in the opera program and the vocal arts program?
Well, we certainly talk a lot to our students about being leaders in the room, in the rehearsal room, in the audition room, around performances, being compassionate to other people, realizing the whole organism of certainly of an opera, but even of a smaller scale recital is more than you. It's how you treat everyone there. I think that's citizenship in the professional sphere, and I think beyond that, there's a recognition which is hard to catch at 18, but by the time you're 25 or 30, you should be realizing that you're part of a much larger artistic continuum, Fred, which may include teaching, which may include developing a series in your hometown, which may include just being an ambassador for the arts in a different way. Where if you're not on stage, maybe you make money in business and become a Jim Marcus. There's so many ways to contribute to that musical ecosystem, and people have to find all the diverse ways in which they can contribute, which are not all about being in the spotlight.
You just used the term that I was about to use, not as well as you just did, artistic continuum. Um, Something I think about a lot, and you were addressing before, is the fact that you knew Eleanor Stieber, who studied with Metropolis. Metropolis studied with people going back. I once spoke many years ago to the violinist Joshua Bell, and he was able to trace back his teachers and who taught his teachers and who taught those teachers and so on, and understood his musical genetic line, so to speak.
Yes, yes.
And while we have wonderful contemporary composers and musicians, and I believe in new works, passionately I believe in new works, we are ever more distant from the greats of the past. So when I was a student in Italy, I knew Maestro Ricci, who studied with Puccini.
Right.
And I can pass along what I learned from Maestro Ricci, with whom I studied 50 years ago, but we're more distant. So the musical continuum, yes, we have YouTube. Yes, we have the Fischer Dieskau recordings and the Elie Ameling recordings, but we're distant from the tradition and the spirit and the feeling and the creativity. I'm not saying it was better, but it was different from now.
And it was authentic from the time of the creation of those pieces.
Yes.
Yeah. So what Eleanor Stieber got from Maestro Reiner, Maestro Zell, Bruno Walter, what Regina Resnick got from Bruno Walter and Wieland Wagner. I mean, these are what Scotto got from her early, Scotto, launched in her late teens. So that was a long time ago.
She lived in a convent in Milan and sang. Her premiere was La Traviata.
Yeah.
And then she went back to the convent to go to sleep.
Well, that's the challenge for us. I mean, I'm in the enviable position of being able to hire a lot of teachers and coaches here at Juilliard. We're looking for people who are rooted in those traditions, Fred. They are further away chronologically than their grandparents were, obviously. And they also are, of course, also creating new work all the time. But I think you just have to look for teachers that have that love of tradition, understanding of tradition. And I mean, if you look at, for instance, a very innovative, authentic artist like a Julia Bullock with a very strong emotional temperament, artistic temperament that shows on the stage from the time she walks out. I think the fact that we're still helping grow talents like that really gives me huge hope for the future. I think about that also with Sasha Cook or Erin Morley or Isabel Leonard, Susanna Phillips, Paul Appleby, these names we can name, Golda Schultz. I'm so proud of what they all bring to the stage. I remember seeing a recital that Paul Appleby gave with a wonderful Russian pianist who also was at both Juilliard and Lindemann with me, called Natalia Kachukova. I don't know if you've heard her play much, but I remember going to a Zankel performance of theirs, which I had nothing to do with. I just went, as an audience member to enjoy it. And I'm walking out of there and thinking, it just was as good as it gets. It was music making of such a high level, personal investment, refinement, open-minded, open-hearted artistry. I thought that I walked out thinking, we're okay. The tradition is not lost. I remember also thinking that after walking out, again, just as an audience member, I had nothing to do with the creation of this program at all, but Golda Schultz did a wild recital a few years ago with wonderful American pianist Jonathan Ware, who was been a student of mine, and he's based in Berlin. He plays much more in Europe and the UK than he does in the States. Anyway, he was on that night at Carnegie. They did a magnificent Ravel Scheherazade, beautiful Schubert, and I just thought, wow, I was privileged to be there that night. I felt I was in the hands of really, really master artists. And
so as we get to our conclusion, although you and I can speak for hours, I think, I believe that you and I met because we were both on the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts.
Yeah, and I think it was on a quiz,
Probably the 1980s. We're both on the opera quiz. I did a lot of quizzes for a bunch of years. You have been a quiz guest as one of the quizlings. You have been the pianist who has played the music
Yeah.
that I couldn't guess. You have hosted the quizzes, and
Yeah.
you developed original features for the
Yeah, I did.
Metropolitan Opera broadcast back when there was more of that. I did a couple of those where I'd focus on a topic. But you did a lot of them, and you did wonderful ones that I think advanced the educational aspect of those broadcasts when that
Yeah.
was more of a factor. Um, you are an educator, not just at Juilliard, but publicly and also in your writings for different journals and so on. Did you see yourself doing this, or was this an outgrowth of being asked because you were already, quote, a collaborative
No,
musician?
I didn't seek it, Fred. I didn't know how to seek that. I mean, the first time I was on a quiz panel, I think somebody got sick. I think, frankly, I was a jump in. I don't know how, but it happened quite late. I guess I did okay. I've been much more frequently the host than a panelist, which it's much better to know the answers than to have to guess the answers.
I know.
I promise you. I promise you that. Yeah, I've never sought that public role. Also, the bits of writing I've done, for Opera News and some other publications, they kind of fell in my lap. I have not really positioned myself in that way. Honestly, in the busiest time of my life, in my, I'd say 30s, 40s, and 50s, I was playing quite a lot. I was running this program at Juilliard. I was also running the Metropolitan Opera Lindemann program at that time for 8 years. 8 of those years. I also ran a program at Ravinia in the summers, which was the Staines Institute for Song.
North of Chicago.
I had so much, yeah, exactly. At Ravinia Festival, yeah. I had so much going on. I just would respond to basically pick up the phone when it rang. I would like to do more broadcasting, particularly. I enjoyed speaking about music. I think I can, when I'm at my best, speak about it in a coherent way that is valuable to people. I enjoy doing that a lot, but that whole world has changed so much. As you say, those years, it was really in the 90s and early 2000s. I did a whole bunch of features for the Met intermission broadcasts. Those kind of essentially went away. I'm glad to be doing the work I'm doing now, but I'm very open to that kind of public education because I believe in it. And I absolutely know in my heart that there's a large segment of the listening population that really wants to know more. They want to understand what they're listening to. They don't want to just follow stars and have a People magazine kind of acquaintance with music. They want to really understand, where does that piece come from? How was it written? How is it different from something else? How does it fit into a larger mosaic artistically? I enjoy doing that, and I look for opportunities to do that.
So
this interview was one of them. So thank you for inviting me.
That was the purpose of my creating this program when the pandemic came, that I wanted to document people such as yourself, whom I've known for a long time, or many people I've never met.
Yeah.
In your case, we've known each other, so that this knowledge would be there for people to find it in the future, listen to it, learn from it, be part of that musical continuum that we were speaking about. And with that, my friend Brian Zeger, I thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Fred. It's been a real pleasure for me to talk with you.
Thank you.